Hey there. Hiya. Thank you for joining me for Whispery History. Today, I would like to talk to you about how Julius Caesar basically controlled time. So, alright, hear me out. The ancient Romans were basically time lords. I know what I said, and I said what I said. I meant it. I'm going to stick with it. Okay, I'm not suggesting that they were like Doctor Who. They wouldn't skip around in time, but they did kind of make the ancient calendar dance to their tune a little bit. So, get this. Politics in ancient Rome were a nightmare. It was a political circus. The people in power were just backstabbing each other all the time. They're literally the reason why backstabbing refers to a betrayal as opposed to just, generally escorting someone off the mortal coil. And that's because Julius Caesar was stabbed in the back by the people that he trusted. So you get the picture, right? Like, politics in ancient Rome was an absolute mess. Now, the Roman calendar before Julius Caesar was just all over the place. It was supposed to be lunar, so a month would be the amount of time it took for the moon to go through all of its phases, which is typically about 29 and a half days. The ancient Romans had it a little bit off, though, and their months would alternate between 29 days and 31 days, and that meant that a year lasted about 355 days. Now, if you're paying attention and doing the solar math, that's about 10 days shorter than it takes for the Earth to revolve around the sun. So that meant that every 3 years you'd be off by as much as a month. Sometimes it would be up to 2 months off. And that messes with farmers a lot. Like, a lot. It meant that sometimes people were trying to plant their spring crops, but it was the middle of the summer because of the calendar, right? On the calendar, it looked like it was the spring, but it was actually the middle of the summer. And let me tell you, these people were already having issues with time. I mean, think about the way a sundial works, right? It doesn't have minutes, it doesn't have seconds, it just has hours. And those hours are measured by the shadow cast by the sun as it crosses the sky. So they would bust the day down into 24 hours like we do, but they would have half of those hours be daylight and half of them be nighttime. So that meant that in the summer, when the days were longer, the hours during the daylight would be longer. And in the winter, when the days were shorter, the hours during the daylight would be shorter. They could be off by as much as a half an hour between summer and winter. Can you imagine? The hours are basically meaningless, right? And now months are all over the place. I've heard people say that time is an illusion. That's probably where they got the idea from. Time was just... Okay, so maybe it wasn't a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff, but it was absolute chaos. The concept of time was pretty inconsistent. Although the politicians of the time did come up with some ideas to sort of readjust, to just reconcile the calendar with the actual seasons. So, in order to do this, they would every once in a while just shove an extra month into a year. Kind of the way we do with the leap year, actually, with the extra day. But they didn't do it regularly, or for that matter, even semi-regularly. They kind of did it on a whim. They kind of did it on the whim of the Pontifex Maximus of the time. Now, Pontifex Maximus means basically the chief priest, is what it translates to. Today we would call him the Pope. At the time, though, It was a position that was voted on by the Comedia Tributa, the tribal assembly, which was one of the 3 legislative bodies of the Roman Republic. So, the Pontifex Maximus would be voted into office, and then he would be the leader of the church, kind of how the king is the head of the Church of England. So, it was a lifelong position. His job was pretty secure. But keep in mind, when your position is lifelong and people want to get rid of you, they're not going to fire you. There's only one way that you're going to retire. Ask Julius Caesar. And let's revisit the old backstabbing concept, right? So, as Pontifex Maximus, you want to make sure that the people who are surrounding you are loyal, and more loyal than Julius Caesar's people were. You also want people who are going to work with you as opposed to against you, and people you like as opposed to people you dislike. So now, while Pontifex Maximus is a lifelong term, not all positions in ancient Rome government were lifelong terms. A lot of them were just 1-year terms. And you couldn't run for office again for another 10 years. So it wasn't all that uncommon for the current Pontifex Maximus to use his ability to slip an extra month into a year and either withhold it or to put an extra month in order to lengthen or shorten someone's time in office. To be honest, sometimes it was done just to create confusion, like to undermine their rivals, mess with the calendar. Think about it. That could mean that there's suddenly a festival going on when the farmers are trying to do their harvest. It could delay elections when someone was in office who was going to keep a war going or delay a war or inhibit trade or enhance trade. There were so many ways that messing with the calendar could benefit the Pontifex Maximus and enhance or tarnish the reputations of his political rivals. Honestly, it was kind of an ingenious loophole to use. I mean, you think gerrymandering in district is evil? These guys were gerrymandering time itself, and it went on for hundreds of years until Julius Caesar came along. And Julius Caesar had been making a lot of changes. He was doubling the size of Roman lands. He was overhauling the tax system. He was expanding the Senate to represent the poor and giving out money and grain to people. He was an impressive guy. But that's not to say that he was entirely fair. I mean, don't get me wrong, the people loved him. The Senate, clearly not so much. He was power hungry, and he was arrogant, and he ignored his senators. He did things without their consent. He kind of acted more like a king or a dictator than an elected official. But again, lifelong term. What are they going to do, fire him? Well, actually, you know the story. They kind of did, in a pokey, stabby, et tu, Brute kind of way. But I'm getting a little ahead of the story here. While Caesar was alive, one of the good things he did was to fix the calendar. By the time he had risen to prominence, the calendar was just completely out of alignment with the solar year. So, in 46 BCE, Caesar decided it was time to straighten things out, to start all over with a new calendar. The first thing he had to do, though, was to get the calendar to match the seasons. He ended up with a year that was 445 days long. 90 days longer than they'd been accustomed to. So that was why 46 BCE was labeled by his political enemies as the year of confusion. Caesar said that Actually, that's the year of confusion ended. And he was right. But we still call it the year of confusion to this day, so I suppose they won that round. The new calendar was going to be 365 days, and it had a leap year every 4 years. Sound familiar? And it was referred to as the Julian calendar. The new calendar eliminated the need to occasionally shove an extra month into a year. It was more scientifically based. It was regular. It was predictable. And the crops would be planted at the same time every year. It was practical, but it was also a bold political statement because it removed one of the tactics of manipulation that was being used by the powers that be at the time. And he was doing it to himself. He was the one in position to be able to shorten or lengthen a year. At the time, he was the Pontifex Maximus. He removed the power from himself. Even so, he had his detractors, people who wanted the traditional values of the Republic to be upheld. He was, get this, he was accused of using the calendar to own ambition and control Rome, but to control the future of Rome. Which just goes to show, no matter what you do or say, somebody's going to say that you're doing and saying the exact opposite. I mean, yes, the Julian calendar did later become the basis for the calendar that we use today. So he did sort of control the future that way. It did get tweaked a few hundred years later, though, when it became obvious that the math was just a little bit wrong. Julian calendar is off by about 11 minutes a year, which isn't a big deal, it would seem. But over the course of a few years, and over the course of a few thousand, it adds up. So now, with our Gregorian calendar, we have a leap year that occurs every 4 years, just like the Julian calendar, but then on centuries that aren't exactly divisible by 400, we skip it. We don't have a leap year. That's why the year 2000 didn't have a leap year when otherwise it would have. So anyway, Caesar's detractors at the time were kind of right. He didn't just end up controlling the calendar during his governance, but for Rome in the future. That wasn't a bad thing, though. I mean, it worked out well for most of us in the future. And because of it, the calendar is now a servant to the people in general, not just to the people in political power. Farmers could trust seasons. Merchants can plan trade routes. Citizens could plan out festivals at the same time every year. There was stability, and there was predictability that wasn't there before. And that is the story of how Julius Caesar controlled time. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Whispery History.